Radio TV phono nut here, and we have something that's a little bit unusual. This is a 3-speed Bel-Aire branded record player from about 1953 or 4. It's a one-tube wonder job, and here's what makes it unusual. We're branded Bel-Aire in the lid, but here we're branded Airline, which was Montgomery Ward's house brand. You can see they have a model number. See if I can see this. 350 GAA 945A, and then they have a line marked through that, and somebody penciled in a model number above it. 45, and I can't make out the rest of it, but yeah, that's the date. These earlier Ward's model numbers are the date code. The 2-digit prefix is the date code, is in 35 would be 1953, 45 would be 1954. I think 54 was the last year they did that. 115 volts, 60 cycles, 45 watts, blah blah blah. As far as one-tube wonders go, these are my favorite types, with the nice metal tone arm and the standard half-inch mount cartridge mounting. These types of tone arms seem to track records a lot better than the newer plastic arms, and with them having 1/2-inch cartridge mounting, you've got more options as far as a cartridge, whereas the little cheap plastic arms with the flipper knob on the front, and you have to get more creative to mount any kind of replacement cartridge in those, and the flipper knob type cartridges are not made anymore, and the new old stock ones that you find are often expensive or suffering from age related issues. So, you know, with these I can put something more modern in them if I have to. Probably what I'm going to do with this one is just put in a static 89T plug-in cartridge in it. That's good for about 1.3 volts. And that's usually enough kick to drive these single tube amplifiers to a reasonable level of volume. The other option would be to put in a fan steel P228, which is good for about 0.8 volts, and add an extra preamp stage to the existing amplifier chassis, but I don't think I'm going to go through all that. I've had good luck with putting an 89T in these types of players, and it still usually gets loud enough for what anybody would need. And when I got this cartridge was just laying inside of the record player with the wires dangling down, broken loose from it. This is an old Webster crystal cartridge that I'm sure is bad. We'll test it for grins and giggles, but I feel like it's bad, and even if it's good, I don't know that I'm putting it back in here, because this is certainly not good for stereo records, and this is likely a 2mm osmium or Sapphire Tip Needle, which was a compromise tip that was supposed to play one mono LPs and 45s and 78s. It was a 78 tip would be 3mm, the mono LP tip would be 1mm, so 2mm is the in-between. It's supposed to play them all, but they usually don't do a very good job at playing records, and they're not very kind to records, so it would be better just to put a more modern stereo compatible cartridge with a flip needle, 1mm for LP and 3mm for 78, and be done with it. Alright, we're set to measure AC, and I'll now stroke my needle, and yeah, this thing's dead as a doornail. No surprise there. And here's an 89T cartridge. I'm stroking its needle, and it's jumping up good, like about 1.5 volts there at the maximum. So that's what we're going to go with. Okay, here's the holder soldered in place, and as you can see, I'm running heat shrink tubing over the terminals for strain relief purposes. Can't tell you how many of these school record players I fixed where the wires would be broken from the terminals from people flipping it back and forth from LP to 78. So putting a little heat shrink tubing over that will kind of give a little strain relief to wires that are already very fragile, so maybe they won't break as easy. Well, that drive mechanism sounds lovely, doesn't it? Bad filter cap, but we are passing signal. Yeah, we're passing signal. Now we need to go through and overhaul the amp, obviously. Here's the amplifier. As you can see, not a lot to it, but still pretty cramped in here nonetheless. It may seem odd, but sometimes it's harder to overhaul these little one-tube wonder amplifiers than it is to overhaul a nice big amplifier with multiple stages in it, mainly because they have everything cramped in such a small space here. But we have our selenium rectifier that will need to be replaced. Obviously, from what you heard, the filter capacitor is bad. We've got this 0.1 microfarad capacitor here. Looks like an isolation cap between the B- and chassis. And then we'll check all the resistors, what few there are, and any of them that are out of spec will be replaced. These two resistors will definitely be changed. You can see one of them is corroded there on the lead. And these are the kind of resistors that are bad about doing that and drifting up in value, so we're just going to go ahead and replace them with something more reliable and then check the other two and see how they are, and if they're out of spec, we'll get rid of them too. Well, actually, this particular amplifier, it would probably be easier just to strip everything off of it and then start over rather than taking each individual part off and then replacing it and then having to fight to get to another part that's behind it that's cramped back up in there. So I think that's the way we're going to tackle this. We're just going to strip it down. Sounds like a Luke Bryant song, doesn't it? Not that I'm a fan of his. In fact, I was very disgusted the first time I heard the local country station play that particular song in a establishment I was in, the flea market actually. I remember thinking to myself how far we've gone down the toilet in terms of country music when you're playing country songs on the radio that basically talk about taking off your woman's clothes and doing whatever to her. Okay, it's starting to take shape. All I have to do is install the filter capacitors on the terminal strip here, install a power cord, and then we'll put another terminal strip here with our diode on it. And for power cords, I had been ordering the ones from Antique Electronics Supply, but they're kind of pricey. So instead, I've been going to Walmart and buying these cheap extension cords that are polarized. All I have to do is cut off the end here, and I've got me a power cord I can use for a lot less money than mail order prices. Now, this cord is a little bit thicker than the original type that comes on these, but it's not as thick as some extension cords that I've seen, so hopefully this will fit on the strain relief that originally was installed. If it doesn't, I'll just have to put a rubber grommet here and just use a cable clamp to hold it in place. Alright, here's our power cord attached. Since the strain relief was not a viable option for this new cord, we just installed a rubber grommet, ran it through the hole, and used a cable clamp to hold the cord in position so it's not going anywhere. And I rewired the power switch to be in the hot side of the line. Formerly it was in the neutral side. And we have the narrow blade of the power cord connected to the power switch, and the wide blade, which is the neutral side, going to B-, which is circuit ground. And that way, assuming you have this plugged into an outlet that's wired correctly, there's no chance of this chassis ever being hot. I mean, even still, the chassis is isolated from circuit ground with this 0.1 microfarad capacitor here, but there could still be enough current leak through here to give you a pretty good jolt. So At any rate, assuming this is plugged into a properly wired outlet, the chassis will always be at neutral, no matter whether the set is turned on or off. Now, had I left the power switch in the neutral side of the line and wired in the power cord, we could have had it where the chassis was cold when the set was on, but whenever you turn the set off, the chassis would be hot because we would have the series string that consists of the tube filament and the motor here to complete the circuit, and there's always maximum voltage across an open circuit, so the only way to prevent this chassis from being energized is to rewire the switch to be in the hot side of the line and wire the hot side of your power cord, narrow blade, to the switch. But like I said, if you plug this into an outlet that's wired backwards, then all bets are off. Alright, filter capacitors installed. Now all we have to do is install another terminal strip here and put our diode in, and then this amplifier ought to be ready to go. Alright, here's our diode installed. AC comes into the anode, the unbanded side. Our cathode, the banded side, is our DC output. Now all that's left to do is to place a resistor between the cathode of the rectifier and our first filter capacitor here. Now, with the selenium rectifier, they used a 39 ohm resistor, but this silicon diode is way more efficient, which means there's way less voltage drop across it, which means we're going to have to go with a higher value resistor in order for our B plus voltage not to be too high. Now, it's not overly critical, but I want to keep the plate voltage on the output tube somewhere around 120, 125 volts if possible. And as far as our filter capacitors, the originals was, well, this 3-section capacitor that I took out was 40 microfarad and 40 microfarad, both at 150 volts, and 20 microfarad for a cathode bypass capacitor at 25 volts, and we're not worried about the cathode bypass. I replaced that with a 22, and we replaced our main filters with two 47s at 250. And the reason I went higher on the working voltage is because these newer capacitors will not take a surge voltage like the old capacitors will, and with a solid state diode, your B plus voltage is going to ramp up to well over 150 volts while the tube warms up. And once the tube warms up and starts conducting, your voltage will fall back down. So we're using a 250 volt cap, so that way the surge voltage won't even be anywhere near the maximum working voltage of the capacitor, and that way the capacitor won't fail prematurely. I guess the battery's about to die in my meter. They hadn't been in here no time. I really need to modify this meter to operate on AC. That way we won't have these problems. Alright, I'm back to my old yellow meter that's about to die. It appears that parts of the display are lighting up that are not fully illuminating, and if you look at it at the wrong angle, it does look like they're fully illuminated, but this is better than the Radio Shack meter that's all of a sudden decided to start beeping for whatever reason. I feel like it's a low battery indicator, but I don't know. Those batteries haven't been in there no time. They shouldn't be running down that fast. Alright, the amp's working. It's not booming volume, but it is working. However, we've still got some filter hum, despite the fact we used capacitors basically the same value as what came out of it, so we may have to go with another filter on the input of straight off of the rectifier. Oh, well, here's the problem. Can you spot it? Looking about the center of the camera. Yeah, I didn't solder that quite good enough. So yeah, when one capacitor is basically out of the circuit, then yeah, it's going to have some hum. Alright, that takes care of that little mistake. Now let's turn it back over and flip it on and see if the hum goes away. Alright, that's better. Much less hum this time.
He wanted, he's a good holy man.
Yeah, there we go. That gets plenty loud enough. Maybe not as loud as it did with a 3-volt cartridge in it, but loud enough, and it still gets louder than a Crosley Cruiser, so there you go. Now we need to address the drive mechanism. Besides this drive mechanism needing the usual cleaning and lubrication, I can see that one thing that's wrong with it is one of the mounting bolts, motor mounting bolts, is missing. But that's not a problem. We have junk record players here that we can obtain the proper mounting hardware off of and get this thing back mounted properly, and then we'll clean and lubricate the mechanism, and then we'll have a good little record player. But that can wait till tomorrow. Alright, I've removed the rubber drive wheel, and it actually appears to be in pretty good shape. This is an older Alliance mechanism, and I've cleaned all this up a little bit. The motor mounts still appear to be in good shape, these 3 rubber thingies here. And I think now would be a good a time as any just to pull the motor out and go ahead and clean and lubricate it. And then I'll rob a mounting bolt and the appropriate hardware off of a junker that's sitting here beside me, and we'll get this motor mounted up in here properly. Then we'll pull this center spindle out, which is held in place by a clip from the underside, and clean all the gunk out of that and re-lubricate it with white lithium grease. And then this thing ought to be about ready to go. Okay, here's the motor, and we want to make sure not to lose any of the remaining washers or spacers or bolts themselves. Alright, I've cleaned out the top bushing and oiled it the best I could. You really can't get that apart very easily, so we usually don't have to. And this bottom one, I'm using an Q-tip dipped in 90% rubbing alcohol to clean this bottom bushing out. Now, if this was really gunked up, I would just soak it in lacquer thinner overnight, but usually this will be enough to get them going again. And you can see the brown gunk we got out of there. And just like with our top bushing assembly, we need to saturate the wick, and you can see that's the cloth material that surrounds the bushing, and you can see this one appears to be pretty dry. Need to saturate that with zoom spout oil and then put a few drops down in the bushing center itself, and then we'll put the motor back together. And you can see it's soaking the wicking material, soaking up the oil there. Alright, there you go. Now while that soaks up, I'll retrieve a bolt and some hardware off of this junk record player sitting beside me, and we'll put the motor back in here. This is your coil and stator assembly, and when you put the motor back together, you don't want to accidentally flip this upside down, because if you do, your turntable is going to run backwards. Now that might be good for playing certain rock records in reverse to see if there's any hidden messages in them, but it's not too good for the regular playback of records. Okay, here we are back reinstalled. That looks a lot better, doesn't it? And people wonder why I keep all this junk that's not worth fixing. Well, sometimes that junk that some people think ought to go to the trash is a very valuable source of parts. Alright, everything's tightened down, and I tapped on the motor with a butt end of my nut driver as I was tightening to make sure the bearings were aligned, or bushings, whatever you want to call them. And as you can see, it turns nice and freely now. Now I need to remove this spindle, which is held in place by this clip, as you can see. And of course, don't let the clip fly off, because if you do, you'll probably never find it again. And don't lose any washers that are associated with that spindle. Sometimes there's one under the clip, and sometimes there's one on the top side. Right here, between the spindle and the bushing itself. Alright, we have the spindle cleaned and re-slathered with white lithium grease. I'll put a couple of drops of Zoom spout oil on there too, just to make it a little more free to move. And then we'll put it all back in the turntable, or the record player rather, and put the retainer clip back on it, and then the spindle will be lubricated. Alright, spindle's back in, clip attached. Now we just need to take a paper towel or Q-tip and remove any excess oil or lubricant that oozed out. And now with the idler wheel off, let's put the platter back on and give it a spin and see how freely it moves. Yeah, quiet as a mouse and good spin down time, and I didn't even kick it very hard. Yep, that's what we want. Alright, I cleaned the inner rim of the platter with a paper towel dampened in alcohol. And we're going to do the same thing to the motor shaft with the motor running. You don't want to get any kind of lubricant. Even the slightest amount would screw up things if you got lubricant on the rubber idler wheel surface, the motor shaft itself, or the inner rim of the turntable. So that has to be completely clean. Those areas have to be completely clean of any kind of lubricant or dirt or any kind of gunk that might cause a lack of traction. Yeah, just like that. See, we're not getting much off of here, but we just want to make sure that there's no oil or any kind of lubricant at all on this motor shaft. Yeah, we got a little gunk off of there. Okay, I've cleaned this up a little bit, put a couple of drops of oil on this shaft, put some white lithium grease on these sprocket teeth, or whatever you call them. Put a little bit of grease on our idler wheel shaft. Now I'm going to clean up this wheel a little bit with some very fine grade sandpaper, and I need both hands to do this, but we just hold the sandpaper with one hand and roll the wheel on it with the other hand, just to sand off the outer surface of old dried up rubber, even though this one feels pretty good, but I'm going to give it the sandpaper treatment anyway. Alright, there we go. Camera won't focus. Try that again. That's a little better. Alright, we have it sanded down. That looks a good bit better, and that should have good traction now. Alright, we're almost there. Alright, so we're in neutral position now on this particular mechanism. It's the dot past 78, and that's the position you should leave it in when not in use, because that pulls the idler wheel back away from the motor shaft, which prevents a divot from forming on the idler wheel surface, which would cause a thump 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 sound as the turntable rotates. 78, 45, 33. Alright, we'll put the platter back on and give it a test. Alright, 33, that's good. Excellent torque. 45, 78, in neutral. Alright, let's try some records. Alright, there it is, cranked wide open with an LP. Like I said, this is not going to have the volume that it once did with the original 3-volt cartridge, but
I never will forget the first time I brought myself to Lafayette.
It gets loud enough, and especially with a hot 45 or 78 that's recorded at higher volume levels than some of these LPs, it'll do fine. Yeah, a record that formerly belonged to my old elementary school, as a matter of fact. You might remember several years ago I did a video of a Caliphone record player and a stack of records that I found at the flea market that just happened to come from my elementary school and had the name of my first grade teacher written on it, so yeah, I had to bring that home. And then I get it back together and then turn it on and get whisper volume that drops down to nothing. I'm about ready just to throw it in the garbage because it's really being more trouble than it's worth. Alright, here's what I think the trouble was. They were using pin 1 of this tube here, which is technically a shield pin. They were using that as a tie point for the audio input from the cartridge, and then they had a 33k ohm resistor going from this tie point to the volume control. Well, I eliminated the 33k ohm resistor because we don't need any voltage drop at all here with this lower output cartridge. We need all the signal going into that volume control that we can get. And I went directly to the volume control and eliminated this tube shield pin here as a tie point, and it seems to be working fine now and not cutting in and out, so we're just going to leave it at that. Well, to cut down on some of the shrillness, I'm going to install a 0.03 microfarad cap between the plate and the cathode, but apparently my first theory about the cutting out, about the tube shield pin causing a problem, is not the real cause because it's still cutting out. And I'm getting fed up with it. Well, unfortunately, I think our problem is defective volume control because it seems to go more berserk when I tap on it. And when I turn the volume control shaft, I can feel an obstruction inside the controls. So I don't know whether we got 10 whiskers growing inside the volume control or some foreign matter in there that's obstructing things, but I think we're going to need a new volume control. Okay, I've disconnected the center pin of the volume control, which goes to the control grid of the audio output tube, and I've connected a 470k ohm resistor from the control grid of the audio output tube to ground, and this amp sounds plenty lively. Yeah. I'm going to tap on it and see if it cuts out, but I believe our problem is going to be an intermittent volume control. Alright, no cutout. So yeah, we need to find a volume control, preferably one with an off-on switch attached to it. And if I can't find such a thing, I'll just put an inline switch in the power cord. Or you can just unplug the record player when you're not using it. I think that's what most people would do anyway. I think I know where a pot is that would work nicely in this thing, but doesn't have a switch. But as you can hear, nothing's cutting in and out like it was before, so yeah, that pot has definitely seen better days. Alright, this is what we need, a 500k ohm pot with a switch. But it's really not that critical. I've seen anywhere from 500 to 1 meg pots used in this application, so we'll just have to take what we can come up with. I've got a solid state Newcomb record player that I've been stripping parts off of. I'll look tomorrow and see what value pot it has in it. I don't want to go under 500k. I do know that pot has no off-on switch on it, but I think it has the type shaft that we need, so I don't know. These pots, it's just something else. You can't just run to the local parts house and get. I remember a long time ago, our local parts house they had kits. You could go down there and tell them what type of pot you need, and they could build you one. And it didn't cost a fortune either. Now you get on eBay and find these old pots, and they want $30, $40, and $50 and more for them, and I'm just not going to do that. Okay, back on the record player, I'm not really having any luck finding a pot. Oh, sure, I'm finding some that are electrically what we need, but not physically. You know, either the shaft is the wrong type, or it's too long, or it's too short, or the threaded stud here is not tall enough. So what we're going to do, and this is one of those nothing ventured, nothing gained kind of deals, is we're going to take this pot apart and see if I can repair it. I've already carefully pried up the little retainer tabs that hold the pot together, and hopefully we can fix this and reuse it. Okay, I didn't notice any tin whiskers or anything like that growing inside. I just washed it out more. I don't think it's going to correct the problem. I think this is just a old worn out pot. Now the rattling I'm hearing is in the off on switch, so I'm dismounting that now and see if we can find out what's rattling around in there. Alright, the switch appears to be working okay. It's just that wafer actuator that's rattling around in here, and I think that's just the nature of it. So we're going to put it back together and make a resistance measurement of the pot, and if it now looks okay, then we'll put it back in the record player. If it doesn't look okay, then we'll just have to do something else, even if it's wrong. Alright, I ran it through its paces, and running from each side of the center wiper, I can start out at 0 ohms and gradually go up to 390,000 ohms without any erratic readings or anything like that. So this pot may be okay now that I took it apart and washed it out really thoroughly. And as far as the roughness and rotation, that's due to the off-on switch being the type that it is, and this is a cheap pot anyway. This is not one of the better quality ones. So all I know to do at this point is put it back in and see what happens. Okay, this pot is flaking out all over the place. I have it turned wide open, and our meter set to the 200 ohms range. 1 meter lead connected to the wiper center pin, and the other meter lead connected to the outermost pin. And when I wiggle the lead with the wiper pin on it, you can see it just goes berserk. Goes from 0 ohms to 200 ohms to 500 ohms. It's just, yeah, this pot is no good. And I'm sitting here asking myself, why can't this be some ragged out thing? That would make my decision to part it out much simpler, but this one's actually in pretty nice shape, and I really don't want to part it out. And I've ran into this situation a lot over the years. You find a nice old radio that's been sitting in Grandma's living room for the past 75 years, and it'll have everything under the sun wrong with it. You find some crusty old radio that the cabinet's falling apart, and no hope of ever getting it to look right again, at least not for any reasonable amount of money. And you put 2 capacitors and a new power cord on it, and it starts playing. Alright, I crimped back down these 3 pins, especially this center pin, put a little solder on it to kind of hold it in place, and it seems to be behaving okay now. But the best test is put it back in the record player and see what happens. Alright, I have everything back in place. I've added the .033 microfarad capacitor from the plate to the cathode of the audio output tube. That'll cut back on some of that shrillness, and hopefully this will stay fixed. It won't get overly loud, but it will get loud enough to listen to. And you can see how packed up this is just with a single tube amplifier. Had I totally gutted this and turned it into a two-stage amplifier, it could have been done, but we would have had to have mounted some components, mainly the power supply capacitors, on a separate terminal strip somewhere. And then I put it back together and get this. No audio. And now it's decided it's going to work.
Such a happy guy.
But that pot is going to have to be replaced, and it's not like I can just run down to the parts house and pick up one. Those days are over with, and I absolutely refuse to get on eBay and pay $40 or $50 for some new old stock part just because you've got greedy sellers on there that think all this stuff's worth 10 fortunes.
Could it be a
Alright.
we will read?
Here we are with a 33 1/3 RPM LP.
We have a surprise tonight. It will make us happy.
You hear all that static it's making? That's just the connections on this potentiometer cutting in and out. Here's a 78, although we don't have a 78 needle on here. Normally this is a flip holder. Normally there'd be a 3mm 78 needle on this side. Flip it over to the LP side, you'd have a 1mm needle. The cartridge that's in here is a dual 1mm needle, but the other side is damaged. The only side that's good is this side. And I'm not going to put one of my good 89T cartridges that has a 1mm and a 3mm needle on it in this piece of junk, at least not until I find a suitable potentiometer for it.
Mount the wings of the morning and fly away past sun, moon, and stars to where I know there's plenty good room. Plenty good room, plenty good room, plenty good room in the Father's kingdom, plenty good room.
It would not hiss that bad, and it would be louder if we had the proper needle in here for playing 78s. But like I said, at this point, I'm not going to put one of the few brand new static 89T cartridges I have in here with the LP and 78 flip needle. In fact, if I don't find a suitable pot for this pretty soon, it may get parted out, despite the fact that it's in such good cosmetic shape. Like I said, if this was in bad cosmetic shape, it would be very easy for me to part this out and not think twice about it. But repair parts like capacitors, resistors, tube sockets, power cords, stuff such as that are still easy to get because those parts are pretty much off the shelf. But if you run into some specialized component like this volume control here, you're going to have a hard time finding that because, like I've said 2 or 3 times already, you just can't run down to the parts house where they have a cabinet full of all necessary parts needed to build you a control that you need. Those days are over with. Now you're stuck with aftermarket crap from China that's not really the right physical part in the first place, or you're stuck paying some ludicrous price for some new old stock part, and I just refuse to do that. It's just not going to happen. Well, I found out our trouble is not all of the potentiometer's fault. This 25L6 output tube is also intermittent, and after I tapped on it in the tube testers, you can see it's showing a short. Well, not only do we have a bad pot and a bad 25L6, but it also looks like the tube socket is intermittent too. I hold the tube in that position and the amp works. Let it go and we have nothing. So I'm about ready to part this thing out. I don't care how good a shape it's in cosmetically, because at the end of the day, it's still just a one-tube wonder record player. And I've got nicer stuff over here that I can fix with these parts and not have the headache of this thing. There's still only about 20 million of these things still in existence, so EOLing this one won't be no big loss, I can tell you that. Okay. I reflowed some of the solder connections, mainly the one on the cathode. That pin looked a little loose. Now I can wiggle the tube and nothing changes one way or another. It was still dead. So I took the control grid pin loose from the volume control, and I have a 680k ohm resistor going from there to ground, and I can touch the control grid now and get a good buzz. Now let's put it back on the volume control and see if we get any. Alright, connected back up, no amplification. All our cathode, screen, and plate voltages look okay, and now I'm going back to this pin 1 that's technically a shield pin that they were using from the factory as a tie point for the cartridge input. Once again, I'm going to remove the cartridge from pin 1 and go straight into this volume control and see what happens. Yep, that's the problem. So I don't know whether pin 1 on this particular tube is actually connected to something, whether that socket is carbon tracked or whatever over the years, and we have a conductive path from pin 1 to somewhere else, but we're going to have to eliminate this pin 1 as a tie point. We're going to have to go directly into the volume control. Alright, measuring from pin 1, which was the tie point pin, to chassis, and we have a dead short. Now I'm going to disconnect the cartridge red wire, see if the short goes away or if it remains. Alright, rechecking, and the short has gone away. I want this camera focus. Alright, 0 ohms there, checking the chassis, no short. But checking across the cartridge wire, the plus wire from the cartridge to chassis, we have an intermittent short. So, got to find out where that is, where that's taking place. And that's where it's happening right here. Old melted, dilapidated tone arm wiring. I'm going to try to unwind this a little bit and see if we can get enough to make a fresh connection. And since we know where the short is, I will reuse our pin 1 tie point on here. Now there's 2 reasons I haven't parted this out by now, besides the fact that it's in decent cosmetic shape. Number 1, I've gone to the trouble to do all this as far as replacing all these other bad parts. And number 2, I don't want to allow a cheapo, as basic as it gets, one-tube amplifier to get the best of me. Looking back further, I found 2 more places with bare wire exposure, and that was where they had it intertwined in this mesh speaker grill cloth. It's metallic. So yeah, I figure that probably had something to do with that insulation being damaged, so we're just going to run some heat shrink tubing over it and be done with it. Alright, I've repaired the wiring with heat shrink tubing, and I slid a piece of heat shrink tubing over this undamaged portion just to protect it from this chassis entry hole here. Now one more time we're going to turn it on and see if it'll play a record without any kind of nonsense. And yeah, I lost my 45 adapter, and I know it's going to have wow and flutter, but I'm not interested in that right now. That sounds pretty good. Alright, I put the old pot back in for about the 5th time just to see what happens. And no, I didn't put it in great. The leads are soldered, but I put them in such a way where if this has to be taken out again, all one has to do is heat the leads and pull them out. So just to recap, we had all kind of intermittent faults besides the usual bad resistors and capacitors and the selenium rectifier that we changed. Volume pot was intermittent. We had an intermittently shorted tube, and we had these cartridge wires that had some bare spots in them that was intermittently making contact to the chassis and killing the signal. So let's turn it on now and see if this pot that I fixed the first time or tried to fix, let's see if it's really fixed or does it really have a problem now. We'll play Helen Ready at 78 RPM. Maybe the content ID won't catch it. But it seems to be working. Now, how long it'll work, I don't know. But for right now, I'm putting it back together, and I'll test run it here over the next few days. And when I'm satisfied that everything is working okay, I will tear back into this and solder that potentiometer back in more neatly, more permanently, and then this one will be done. So yeah, about the only electronic components I didn't have to address in this set was the motor, the speaker, and the audio output transformer. Everything else needed my attention. And I better knock on wood, because the way this project's gone, any one of those three parts that I mentioned not having to touch could very well decide to take a dump on us. And there we are with a 78. Like I said, that's the wrong type of needle. That's the reason it's so hissy. But it gets plenty loud enough. Alright, I'm done with this, and I'm sure you're about tired of looking at it too, so I'll break it off here and more to come later. Well, like so many of my other videos, when I think we're done, we wind up not being done, and this volume control is starting to act up again. Let's see if it'll do it now on camera. See, when I get down to the bottom of its range, it goes to maximum volume. So yeah, that control is just worn out. There's nothing more I can do for it. I've looked through my junk stash. I'm still not having any luck finding anything. I'm going to continue to look, but I don't know what's going to take place. I looked on eBay, and most of what I'm finding is crap straight from China, and I'm not going to order some part from China that's probably of inferior quality anyway. And the way things are with the Postal Service, with all the COVID-19 stuff, it'll probably take it 6 months to get here, and I don't want this tied up that long. The stuff I'm finding from U.S. sellers is, like I've already mentioned, the price gouged stuff. So I'm going to continue to look and see if I can find something. If I can find something with a flat shaft on it or a half round shaft, we're just going to have to change the knob out to something like this that actually come off of a junk record player, but the pot physically won't work. So I just don't know what we're going to do here. We could just let it go like it is and be done with it, and this is one of those situations where people just need to understand that there's some cases where you can't make something old work 100% again. You're just going to have to be happy with the way it works and be done with it. Okay, I might have found something. This is the closest thing I've found so far. This is that Caliphone amplifier that came out of that school record player that we parted out recently. I really didn't want to cut this up because I was going to possibly do something with this amp, but, you know, it is what it is, and this has a suitable pot that I think could work, but the shaft is the half round type, so like I said, we're going to have to swap the knob over. We can't use the knob that originally came on the record player, but this particular pot is a much better quality pot than anything I could get out of China today, and it's a better quality pot than the one that came on the record player. So I think we're going to take this off, and if we can mount it up in there, then we're going to use it. Okay, here's the pot removed physically. I think it'll fit, but here's the deal. It measures 3 megohms, where the original is a 470K. But we just gonna have to make this work some sort of way. I'm running out of options here. What I may end up having to do is just place a 470K resistor from the grid of the audio output tube to ground, and just use a capacitor to couple this pot to the control grid of the audio output tube. Like I said, we're running out of options here, and we just gonna have to make what we got work. This is the closest thing I've found so far. But this is a much better quality pot than what came on it originally. Well, it ought to be. This came off of a industrial grade school record player. These were meant to take abuse, so I would expect this would be better quality. One of the good things about eBay is I can often search for PhotoFact schematics for these old one-tube wonder phonographs. And since the sellers are nice enough to scan the whole front image of the PhotoFact, and that's where the schematic is usually located, I can enlarge the pictures and see what I need to see without buying the PhotoFact. Hey, that's not my fault. The seller shouldn't put the whole thing out there for the world to see. Some sellers are smart and don't do that. Some sellers just photo the whole front page where the schematic is. But anyway, I looked at a whole bunch of different one-tube wonder schematics, and I think we can get away with using this 3 meg potentiometer. Here's a rather crude schematic. My artistic ability is not that great of the original circuit the way it is now. We have our cartridge going into the top end of the volume control. The bottom end of the volume control goes to circuit ground. The wiper terminal of the volume control, which by the way is a 500K ohm, connects to the control grid of the first audio tube. And we have I don't need to explain the rest of it, but the way we can get away with using a 3 meg pot is to insert a grid stopper resistor between the center wiper of the volume control and the control grid. Something along maybe a 33 to 39K ought to work. So we just break our connection and put the 33 or 39 or 27K, it's really not that critical, between the wiper and the control grid. And what this does, between this resistor and the capacitance of the vacuum tube, that gives us a low-pass filter that helps prevent parasitic oscillations within the vacuum tube, and it also keeps out possible radio frequency interference. And when using a pot that big, we could come near having interference pick up and oscillations that we don't need, etc. And in some schematics I saw, not only do they have a grid stopper resistor here, or a grid blocker, whatever you choose to call it, I've seen it called both, but they also had a 470K resistor from this point to ground. So yeah, 470K, but we'll try it first without the 470K and see how it performs. And then if we need to add it, we'll add it and see if it makes any difference. But yeah, this is about as basic of an amplifier as they come. Okay, we're mechanically installed. It fits beautifully in place. Now, like I said before, I had to switch the knobs because of the style of shaft used, but this knob is pretty much a generic record player knob that was used on about 10 billion different models. This brown knob is also a generic record player knob, and it was also used on 10 billion different models. So, this knob will work just fine on here, and the average person would look at it and they wouldn't even know that it's a non-original knob unless I told them. Okay, we have the new pot, or the new used pot installed. There's our grid stopper resistor down in here, 39k ohm, and I added a couple of cable clamps. Well, one here that I originally had, and I put another one up here to hold the power cord in place. That way there's no way anybody can yank this out and damage anything, and there's no way this can come in contact with any heat producing items such as vacuum tubes. Now, if it's not asking too much, could you please just work this time? I'm about tired of fooling with this. Alright, it's working. It may not be quite as loud as it was, but that's just the nature of the beast.
That's how I know.
I'm going to put the screws back in the motor board, and we're going to test run it. And I hope we can end this very soon. So yeah, just to recap, the only electronic components in this record player that I didn't have to give attention to was the motor, the speaker, the audio output transformer, and the tube socket. And I guess you could say technically I had to give attention to the motor because I had to take it apart and lubricate it. So technically the only things that didn't need any service was the speaker, the output transformer, and the tube socket. But like I said earlier, I better knock on wood because the way this project is gone, any of those parts could crap out at any given time. Okay, since we got this thing working reasonably well, I went into my stash of cartridges and found an 81T that's a LP78 flip type. And it looks like it's got a 1976 date sticker on it. I hope it's still good. I hope it hasn't died from sitting up. We'll know in just a minute. Oh yes, that's a lot better. Lot better.
Sad-eyed baby, you look so alone and blue.
We were made for each other as the stars were made for the sky.
And last we'll play a 78, so we need to flip our lever over here to the 78 side.
Oh my love, just what sin have I been guilty of?
Okay. Sounds pretty good now, doesn't it?
Why am I so in love? Why am I all aglow?
Alright, there you go. Now I hope this is the end of it, because I know I'm tired of looking at this thing, and I really know you're tired of looking at it by now, if you've made it this far.